Good morning, brothers and sisters. Let me read for you 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 16. Peter writes, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name." There's so much goodness here, of course, friends, but let me just mention a thing or two and I'll leave the rest to your own diligent searching. Yesterday, we talked about how we suffer as Christians because we discipline ourselves in the process of sanctification. We deny ourselves, our natural sinful impulses. We put to death that sin nature day in and day out. And that can be and will be painful. But even in doing that, we participate in the new life of Christ. And today, Peter tells us that we shouldn't be surprised when we suffer from external sources for the sake of Christ either. The example he gives is being insulted for the name of Christ, which I take as an example that stands for all the kinds of persecution we might face as Christians. And this speaks to something we touched on yesterday, that these kinds of insults and the resultant suffering are simply part and parcel to the identity of a Christian. Don't view them as strange, Peter says, as if they were odd occurrences, rather expect them. We live in a world that is hostile to God, hostile to Christ, and therefore is going to be hostile to us. And so Peter says, don't be surprised when this comes upon you. And he calls those insults fiery trials, because that's what they are. They're trials. And like any other trial, you can overcome or you can be defeated. And so Peter is calling on us to overcome in those trials, but to do so specifically by rejoicing. When we suffer specifically for the sake of Christ, then that is a sign of blessing. That is a sign that God is really with us. And that might seem like an ironic thought, because most of the time we might think that things going well would be the sign that God is with us. After all, if God is with us, then won't things be smooth sailing? But no, Peter says that when we suffer for the sake of Christ, that is actually an indicator that God is with us, that the Spirit of glory rests upon us. And while ironic from an earthly perspective, this is the most natural thing again, because if the world hates God because of his truth, his righteousness, his holiness, and if he is within us, and so the world sees his truth and righteousness and holiness within us, then the world is going to hate us as well. And so we should not be surprised when we face insults or persecution of whatever sort, but rather rejoice in them, because receiving them, having those insults come upon us, only indicates all the more clearly that we do indeed belong to God and that we're doing what God wants us to do. And we are actually becoming more and more like him, which is pretty awesome. But even there, Peter gives us a bit of clarification. He says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler." Because some people have taken the idea of suffering and run with it in the wrong direction. They take the idea of suffering itself and they say suffering is good. Suffering is a sign of holiness or a sign of piety all on its own. And they forget or they ignore the fact that the kind of suffering in view here that Peter's talking about is suffering for Christ's sake. It's not just general suffering, it's suffering for Christ's sake. And yet we run across people at times who sin, who make poor choices, who succumb to foolishness, or who even specifically desire to suffer for someone other than Christ, and then they make themselves into martyrs, and they think that they're doing the right thing, not because of Christ, but simply because they're suffering. And so they put all of the emphasis on suffering as an indicator of goodness, but it must be suffering for Christ's sake. And Peter warns against such deception. If we suffer for sinful actions, sinful choices, sinful lives, lives that are not directed toward Christ, then that suffering is warranted and not an indicator of God's blessing at all. And based on the next line, that kind of suffering should actually cause a person to have shame. But, Peter says, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. And what an awesome statement. This is one of the relatively few times the actual term Christian is used in the scriptures. But here Peter says, if you've been labeled a Christian and if you are suffering for it, then don't feel shame for that label, for that name. Don't let the name Christian become a shameful thing in your thinking. Rather, glorify God that you are found worthy to be identified with Christ and to share in his sufferings. So friends, let us first be willing to bear insult and injury for the sake of Christ. And then let us recognize what it is, a blessing, and let us take glory in that suffering. So have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I will catch you next time.